So the thing about the origin of the alphabet, ladies and gentlemen, is that a lot of people don't understand this. That actually the alphabet is something very special. It's not something like other things you might have heard of. It's not like, for example, the writing of the Chinese or the Indians or the Egyptians, which are pictographic. Okay, that is, they have a picture that represents some kind of thing. Usually, it represents a portion of a word or represents a word in itself. So the picture represents a word. Of course, languages have so many thousands and thousands of words that it's impossible to remember all those words. So that's why we need hang on. Sorry, I'm trying to find my things here. That's why we need a actual alphabet, because the alphabet is basing it. It's like it's a letter for each sound that the human voice box can make. So that allows us to actually present any word with just a few different characters, right? Whereas with these pictographic languages, you have thousands and thousands of pictograms. It's almost impossible to remember them all. So you need only like very highly educated people are able to write well in those languages, right? But in with an alphabet now, you can actually understand. Well, even a normal person can remember all the letters and be able to read and understand the things. Okay. Sorry, I'm just waiting for my my PowerPoint thing to get in. Okay, here it is. All right, so here's my PowerPoint. Phoenician or Hebrew, the origin of the alphabet. Okay, because most people will teach you that the alphabet came from the Phoenicians, but in fact, that's not entirely clear. All right, and the Phoenician alphabet is dated till around 1000 BC, but the Bible, or the time of Moses, for instance, are like 1500 BC. So we're talking about a 500-year difference, right? So their claim is that the Hebrews picked up the alphabet from the Phoenicians. But over time, more and more findings have come up in archaeology and in this type of study that has shown that it's much more complicated than that. The actual story is much more complicated than that, okay? So the traditional view is that, that the Phoenicians invented the alphabet 1000 BC. And the script then spread by the Greeks, then the Latins, then to modern alphabets that we have today. Okay, so that's the idea. The Phoenicians started it. The Phoenicians were these people living on the Mediterranean Sea, and they were travelers. They were seafarers. They would trade all over the place, right? So that's why it was thought that, okay, they are the ones who developed the alphabet and then spread it through their trade networks, and then other people learned it, like the Greeks and the Romans, and then they popularized it, right? That's the idea. But Phoenician inscriptions were carved in stone, and they're also found all around their different trade hubs. They would leave like these little colonies around the Mediterranean, and those will become these great cities like Carthage, Tyre, Sidon, and so people would hear those. People would travel to those cities to trade with them, and they would study their alphabet and learn that, and they would leave these stone inscriptions there. So that's why we're able to see that, okay, yes, they certainly did use the alphabet, and they had an alphabet, because we can see on their stone inscriptions that they used it. But this argument rests, the idea that they're the ones that invented it because they have the earliest inscriptions, rests on the fact that those are what survived. Those stone inscriptions are what survived. But it's not necessarily what came first. That's the difference. All right? So if you've been told that the Phoenicians invented the alphabet, that we owe our letters, our books, our language itself to them, and you'll find that in nearly every textbook, historical timeline, or even any academic article. But it's based on those stone inscriptions, not based on what actually happened in the reality. We don't know what happened, right? So around 1000 BC, these inscriptions start showing up. Let me show you some of these. Oh, what's this one? Oh, so yeah, I'm trying to debunk this idea, right? That the Phoenician went to the Phoenicians, to the Greeks, to the Latins. That's the idea we've been given. But I'm trying to show that there's a better way to understand this. For example, a scholar in 2014 named Hamilton, he proposed this idea that it was a Canaanite convergence. The different cultures in Canaan created something kind of alphabetic, and then they converged, and then the Phoenicians picked up on that, living in Canaan. They picked up on it, and then they spread it. Okay, but they're not trying to say that the Phoenicians invented it. That's kind of fallen out of view now. And even Cross, even back in 1967, this man Cross, he was already saying that the Phoenicians standardized it, but they were not the origin of it. Okay, so it's already been this idea has been kicking around since the 60s. But still, when we go, if you look this up or if you Google it or something, most articles, most schools and stuff will teach you that it's from the Phoenicians. Even when I was in school, when I was studying the Bible in school, they would say that it's by the Phoenicians. And I would always challenge it. Like, wait a minute, is that really true? Because, like I say, Moses predates the Phoenicians by over 500 years, or the earliest inscriptions we have from them by 500 years. So, the whole idea that they invented the alphabet is built on this very fragile foundation. The archaeology favors the stone findings, but we should also look at other findings such as this. So, for example, they'll find these stone inscriptions. This is not a Phoenician inscription. I wasn't able to find one quickly just now, but this is an inscription by Esar Haddon. But these are the kind of inscriptions that they find generally, right? They find these inscriptions on stone because that survives. But they don't find the Hebrews would write on skin, on parchment, on papyrus, and things like that. So they don't survive, right? Unless they're very carefully kept. So for that reason, we barely find the Hebrew writings. If the Hebrews were first, we wouldn't know because we're just not able to see it, right? So the Phoenicians had all these ports around the Mediterranean, like I was telling you, Carthage, Tyre, Sidon, and they would have these stone inscriptions there. So that preserves things. But the parchment, the skin, and the wood writings, or the wood carvings that the Hebrews did, and because they're like kind of like nomads, right? They would go around with their tents and with their flocks, and so they often wrote on things that don't survive that long time in terms of archaeology. Okay, so as I was telling you, Cross, he suggested that the Phoenicians standardized the form, but they were standardizing something that was from earlier Canaanite writing. Okay. And another scholar who I guess I don't have them here, but her name was Avi Nemirovskaya. She showed how Phoenician dominance is tied to their trade networks, not to the fact that they had the original alphabet. Okay. So they didn't invent the code. They just marketed it the best, and they were able to spread it through their trade networks. So what R.G. Lehmann said is that alphabet history favors what didn't rot. You see, this type of writing that the Hebrews would do on the left, that rots, right? But this type of writing that this type of stone writing that the Phoenicians had, that survives, right? So if the Phoenicians weren't the first, though, who was, right? That's the question. And so To find the real inventors, we have to leave these bustling cities, the port cities of the Phoenicians, and go into the mines of Sinai, where there was this radically simpler script used, okay? Phonetic and efficient, and it was Semitic, all right? It was just carved centuries before the Phoenicians, okay? So I was supposed to show you some glyphs here. Let me see. So this is actually an early. What they do is they see this is scripture that was made in stone, and then they take a piece of paper and they rub the charcoal on it till they get that kind of press, right? And then they get this. So this is one of the earliest forms of writing that they found that was alphabetic, and this is an inscription found at Wadi El Hol. All right. Wadi is like, remember the wadi is those little waterways, right? Where in the rainy season, it gets full of water. But then usually most of the wadis, they dry out during the summertime or during the dry season, right? So it was found in one of those places on the wall. And they just scratched it off with one of these things and were able to find these things. So this one has been dated to 1850 to 1550 BC, which is long before the earliest Phoenician scripts. Okay, and so this is written in a Semitic language using acrophony. Acrophony is like they use one symbol like this, one glyph as they call it, to be the first sound of a word. All right. But actually, scholars have looked at this, like Simons, 2011. He said that the Hebrew vocabulary best fits this phonetic logic of this type of writing. So it's more likely to be Hebrew, according to scholars such as Simons, than it is to be Phoenician. Okay. Now, let me see if I have some more slides on this. This is the chart of the it's like, so they would have, this is the name of the letter originally, Aleph, and this is the pictograph that they would originally use for it. Okay, and it had a meaning like this, to be a leader or to be strength, but it became just a letter over time in the Hebrew, right? And these are all the different pictographs that they would use. Okay. So just wanted to show you that chart. And then I think I have a map here. Okay. This is a map I found. The documented inscriptions, where are they located, right? So you have, I don't know how to show this on. Can you see can you see my mouse if I put it on this thing? I don't know. Oh, you can't even see that, eh? I don't know how you can see my mouse. Anyway, so you see how it says Wadi Nasib Serabit al Kadim? That's one of the places where they found this writing, right? And then here, the one that I showed you before, the one that was scratched with the charcoal. I mean, I'm talking about this one. This one. This is found at the site at the bottom of the map called Wadi El Hol. Okay. And then Lahun is another place where they found some writing as well. But these are just some of the places where they found these type of writings, right? So to find the real beginning of the alphabet, we don't go to Tyre or Byblos. We go into the desert, actually. That's where it's actually been found, the earliest ones. And it's usually these rugged, like, mining zones in the Sinai Peninsula. And these sites here, like Timna, Wadi al-Hol, Serabit al-Kadim, and Timna I already said, right, have yielded descriptions that are much older than the Phoenician examples by 500 years or even more. So it's much more likely that this is the origin of writing. And these aren't these carvings for kings on monuments, right? They're just scratched into the rocks by miners or by traders on the paths. Okay, so it wasn't a script of the elite of the kings or anything. It was a functional working script, and it was designed to represent speech so anybody could just read it easily. All right. And the genius of this system is that they're using what I was saying is called acrophony. They're actually taking a symbol to represent the sound. Yeah, Moses wrote all the words of the Lord. Exactly. That's what we're gonna get to that too. And Moses was learned in all the ways of the Egyptians too, right? Don't forget that. But sorry, Jessica Romica. Sorry, I haven't gotten a chance to check it out. I'll check it out. So if we go back to the charts, you have a language like this, or sorry. You have a thing like this, a house. Beit is a house, okay? So it looks kind of like a house. That's why they draw it like that. So it becomes this intuitive thing. The beit represents the house, right? And it's flexible because it can switch from B of a house, beit, or B to something else like some other word, right? So it's radically different from the hieroglyphs of the Egyptians, right? The Egyptians would use a picture to represent a word or a concept, right? Whereas this is using a picture to represent just a sound that your mouth can make. And they have enough letters here to represent every sound that the human mouth can make so that they can represent any language just using these letters, right? That's the idea of it. That's why an alphabet is so powerful, because it's just intuitive. You just understand. Once you can memorize all the sounds of the alphabet, then you can sound out any word you see, and that allows anyone to be able to learn it. So it's not confined to scholars anymore or to the highly educated. Anybody can learn an alphabet and just be able to read basically, and they'll learn the rest as they go, right? But it's something that allows writing to be widespread. Okay. Now, as I was saying, Simon says that Simon is one of the scholars. You'll find him in the bibliography. You can see the bibliography in the description. Okay, he says the Proto-Sinaitic signs align better with early Hebrew than with Phoenician lexemes. Lexemes are like the way the word sounds. Okay. And another scholar named Wimmer in 2010 said that he confirmed that Proto-Sinaitic glyphs, that's like these, are phonetic and they're Semitic. And they're plausibly connected to these mining laborers. Okay. So the oldest alphabet we know was scratched in Hebrew-sounding letters centuries before the Phoenicians carved theirs into their city walls. So it doesn't prove that the writers were Hebrews, but it makes it very hard to claim that the Hebrews were illiterate and they just learned it from the Phoenicians. That doesn't make any sense, because we have writing that's Hebrew or Semitic anyway, probably Hebrew too, by the way, but it's like much earlier than the Phoenicians. So the idea that people have that the Hebrews were illiterate and learned it from the Phoenicians, that doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense, okay? This is another one. This is another example of some of the writing that they found, some of these glyphs. So that's some of the writing. Petrovich, this is one of the scholars. He's very much on the right. It's very much on our side, shall we say, right? But he's a little bit. Maybe he took it a little bit too far, but he identified biblical names in some of the Sinai inscriptions. Those inscriptions that I showed you the map of, that's the Sinai inscriptions. These inscriptions, like here at this yellow place, Lahun and Wadi El Hol, these are the Sinai inscriptions, they're called. These are the earliest inscriptions of the alphabet we've ever seen, okay? And Petrovich identified biblical names in them. He might have gone too far with it, but the fact is, even other scholars have identified this as Semitic writing and probably likely to be Hebrew. So you have people like Holmstedt and Wilson Wright and Brett and Begg. They will critique Petrovich and say, "Oh no, he went too far to say that." Petrovich is like saying that, "Oh look, this is the name Moses, this is the name El," but these scholars will say, "No, no, no, he went too far." Homestead, Wilson Wright, and Begg. But at the same time, they'll admit that he's right, that it's probably Semitic, probably even Hebrew. Okay. So the Hebrew association with these is very plausible. It's maybe not definitive. We don't have 100% proof, but it's definitely plausible. Okay. Now the question is, did the Hebrews actually inspire? Did the Egyptians inspire the alphabet? All right. So a lot of those writings that I showed you from the map, right? This map, these writings are often associated with Egyptians as well. Some of their miners and some of their other laborers. So some people think that the early Semitic laborers saw the Egyptian hieroglyphs, and in places like Sarabit al-Qadim, and then they went and developed the alphabet from that idea. They just said, "Oh, look, they use pictures to represent words. Let's see what we can do with this." And then they started playing around with it, and they developed the alphabet. That might be, but it seems unlikely to me. But scholars like such as Goldwasser and Hamilton suggest that that's how they came up with it. The Proto-Sinaitic form, that's what I'm talking about, this is what they call the Proto-Sinaitic. Proto-Sinai, the first Sinai writing. They suggest that it's because they were looking at the Egyptian glyphs and they developed this idea from that, right? And so because they didn't know what the Egyptian glyphs meant, but they could figure out that okay, they're using words, they're representing words with sounds or with sounds with these pictures. So then they developed it based on sounds, acrophony. All right. So they adapted the Egyptian visual symbols, but they used acrophony to represent Semitic speech. All right. But notice this again, as I was saying to Glory earlier, Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. So the Egyptians provided the medium, the idea of putting pictures onto a thing to represent words, but it's actually the Hebrews that took it the next step to say, okay, let's make this into an alphabet using acrophony. All right. The Semites provided the message of it. Okay. So because the Egyptians, they used a script that was for their priest class to represent their religious things. All right. And the hieroglyphs served as this visual inspiration for the phonetic, for the alphabet. But the alphabet is phonetic, it's not pictorial. It's not just a picture representing a word, it's actually representing the sounds we use, right? So the Hebrews didn't copy this thing, they transformed it into something much different, much better, right? Let me see what I have for sorry, I thought I had this thing. Anyway, let me see if I can show you this thing. Okay. I thought I had one on my thing. So this is maybe a beginning of it, possibly. I don't know if you can see this. This is hard to see, right? But as the glyphs become these... Hang on, let me see if I can find a better one. This is interesting too. So this would be the hieroglyph type image, and then it becomes into this writing, into the Hebrew character, right? This is the house. It becomes Beit, the house. And not sure what this picture is, but this is the Dalit. So this is some pictures of that type of thing. I don't know. I'm sorry. I thought I had a picture of this thing, but I guess I don't. Anyway, let's go back to the other thing. So we don't want to confuse. So what these scholars are saying is we don't want to confuse ethnicity with the language, right? They're trying to say, look, don't be so quick to just assign it to the Hebrews. Be careful, and let's make sure we do this right. So first there was Ugaritic, right? That was one of the earliest writings. Let me see if I have. Oh, this is a picture of some of the Ugaritic writing. Okay, but let me show you. So first there was Ugaritic writing. That's like from what do they call it? Mesopotamia in modern day Iraq. So the earliest writing was from there, Ugaritic, and it looks like this. If you can see that. Oh man, I can't even make it bigger. Wow. How do I make this bigger? I guess I can't. Anyway, well, what they do is they take this little wedge thing and they poke it into the clay, and then they dry the clay so it gets hard. So then you have the writing there, right? So they just poke their little thing into it. They call it cuneiform, and that's the type of writing they had. But it's not, again, it's not a letter. It's not like it's not an alphabet where every word sounds, or every like letter has this just a sound of a sound we make with our mouth, and then you can form those into words, right? This is where the symbols actually form a word usually, or a concept. Okay, so that's why it's totally different situation. So we're not seeing the alphabet popped into existence out of nowhere, you know. The earliest Semitic inventors of the alphabet probably saw early Egyptian hieroglyphs, and it might have even been Moses. I still do want to put that idea out there, but they definitely, whatever Semitic people invented the alphabet, they saw the early Egyptian hieroglyphs, and they developed the alphabet from that, probably, right? Because they're surrounded by this stuff. They're just it's all around them, in temples, in mines, in shrines. But what they created was totally different. An alphabet is completely different. It's not image based, it's sound based. That's the difference, right? So the Egyptian idea gave them the symbol, but they gave it a voice. And look, and like I was saying to you, the scripture confirms this in a way, right? Because Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, Acts 7:22. Okay, so Moses was educated in that language, that type of learning, and so he would have learned that, and he would have been able to develop an alphabet from that. Okay. Maybe this is what I was trying to say. So these are some of the different pictographic writing that they would use. Okay, you have these early pictographs, and then they get kind of turned around, and then they get made into letters. You see, the early Babylonian is based on these earlier pictographic writings. See, then you have the Assyrian is based on the Babylonian, But these, once again, these are not alphabets. These are just pictographic writing, where they take a picture to represent a word. Okay? This is representing a bird. This is representing a fish. But they're not able to make a symbol that represents a sound to develop a whole like word from different sounds, you know? But Moses was educated in all these things, right? In this exact context of pictographic representation of words. So the man who would later write Genesis, he had access to the Egyptian writing and to the Semitic alphabet, you know. So that would have allowed him to create the writings that we have today, that we have in the Bible. Okay. Obviously, he's not going to use the Egyptian way. He's going to use the Hebrew way, you know. And the Hebrew way seems to predate him. Like I was telling you, those writings are dated to like these writings here, like this type of thing. These are dated to like 1850 BC. Moses is coming around 1500 BC. Okay, so these things were already in the Hebrew mind, but he also was able to absorb the wisdom of the Egyptians as well. So that's the other thing. So that's how we know where the alphabet began. It began in the Sinai area, and it began like in these regions here. That's where it began. But the Phoenicians, they're up here. Okay, I don't know if you can see that. I can't even see my mouse, right? But anyway, the Phoenicians are up on the Mediterranean there at the north. In the north, that piece of water, they're on the coast of there, okay? The Phoenicians. So that's why they probably learned it later from them, from the Hebrews, you know? Now, what if the Hebrews weren't the only Semitic group committing writing things at those times, right? I'm not saying that all these early Proto-Sinaitic writings, like such as this, I'm not saying they were all Hebrews. I'm just saying that they're Semitic, and so it could be other Canaanites or the Midianites or whoever, right? But they're Semitic groups. They're not these Phoenicians and stuff, you know. Even the Phoenicians are Semitic too, but they're not the ones who developed it, you know. But this system is born among these Semitic peoples, and the Hebrew language makes the most natural use of this type of structure. Okay, and that's also borne out with scholars as well. So, okay. We looked at Ugaritic, right? So, okay, let me just see. Well, let me go back to the Ugaritic a little bit. So, with this Ugaritic thing, this is from around 1400 to 1200 BC. The city of Ugarit, which is in modern-day Syria, actually, okay? And they're using this cuneiform. It's kind of alphabetic. It's got 30 characters. It's written on clay using a wedge, all right? And this was invented independently of Phoenicia or the Proto-Sinaitic, okay? So it shows that there's this parallel innovation. But this is actually kind of alphabetical. It's not like like the Egyptian. It's not like pictographic. It's actually alphabetical, but it's in a totally different sense, you know? So it's an independent invention of the alphabet, independently of the Hebrews, okay? Or of the Semitic people of Sinai, okay? So these people in Ugarit, it's written in cuneiform. They had 30 distinct symbols, and they had phonetic values just like an alphabet, okay? So the Ugaritic shows that there are many Semitic cultures that were experimenting with these alphabetic ideas. All right. So even Cross, as I was reading to you before from that scholar Cross, he recognized Ugaritic as part of a larger convergence of early writing systems, not a descendant of the Sinai inscriptions, but a different invention. Okay. So alphabetic writing didn't come just from one single genius moment, but it arose in these multiple different regions among Semitic people who were already primed to think in these phonetic terms about writing. Okay. So even if we set aside those Proto-Sinaitic things that I was showing you before, Ugaritic proves that Semitic scribes were already thinking alphabetically before the rise of the Phoenicians. All right. They weren't in Tyre and Sidon. They're all the way over in the east, in Syria, in Iraq and stuff, right? So they used tablets, not temples, to preserve their thoughts. So the whole idea that the Phoenicians are the inventors, right? The very existence of Ugaritic shows that that's not right, because they had alphabetic writing, and it began with them. You know, it was earlier than the Phoenicians, right? So it's a parallel solution to the same problem. How do you represent sound with symbols? They were already doing it. So it shows that the broader Semitic culture already had alphabetic ideas in their head already. Okay. So the idea of giving the credit to the Phoenicians is also just not, it's just like storytelling. It's not logical, you know? So, but if Semitic people like those in Ugarit were already using alphabets, why don't we find more Hebrew inscriptions from that time? Why does Phoenicia get all the glory, right? So it has to do with what survived, as I was telling you before. The parchment rots, but the stone stays. Okay? So history favors what didn't rot. And I had a visual. Let me show you that again. See, remember this? The history favors what actually remains for archaeologists to find, right? They don't find these things from that far back. This is from like the time of Christ. But they can't find these type of writings on skin and paper from that far back. But they can see these things, these stone things. That's why they tend to favor those ideas more, just because they're the ones they find. But it's not a good way to think of history. It's not a good way to understand these things. Okay. So here's some of these scholars that I was looking at. Petrovich, he saw the Sinai inscriptions and he thought that they included Hebrew names like Moses and El. Okay. He probably went a little bit too far with it. But even Simons, who's much later, he said that Hebrew phonetics best match the Proto-Sinaitic glyphs. Okay. And then even Albright, who is critical of Petrovich, he said that letter names reflect the Hebrew, but not the Phoenician. And then Holmstedt, he says, look, we shouldn't try to assign it to one single ethnicity, but he even affirms that it is Semitic. It's not Phoenician. Okay. And so even the critics of our view concede that the early alphabet was Semitic, not Phoenician. Okay. Sorry if you can't read the bottom thing. So that's important. That even the critics of our view acknowledge that it's true. It's probably Semitic. It's not necessarily Hebrew. They won't go with the Hebrew idea, but they'll say, yeah, it probably is Semitic. The standardization probably followed the ships. It's because the Phoenicians had their ships and their maritime networks. They spread it, and they used these durable stone inscriptions that stayed. And they had urban centers, right? They had like a whole infrastructure of scribes and stuff in their cities, And so that allowed them to keep these things in these kind of durable forms, like in writing on stone and stuff. All right. So it's not necessarily the earliest, but they're the most visible. Okay. Now maybe I should show you a map of some of these Phoenician trade routes. Sorry, guys, I wasn't able to get all my stuff together. But here's an example of some of their trade routes. Okay, so they would be all over the place. This is where Egypt is, and Sinai and Jerusalem is here around here. Okay, so then, but the Phoenicians would be traveling all around the place, and they have their cities here. Like this is Tyre, Sidon. This is their cities that they would have on the coast here. All right. So that's why they're able to spread the alphabet around, and the Greeks and later the Romans adapted it from them. Okay. So if the earliest alphabet was Semitic, possibly even Hebrew, why did the Phoenicians get the credit? Because of their visibility. All right. They dominated the Mediterranean through their trade, and they exported textiles and cedar. It was there when they exported things. That was the script that they used, right? So their trade influenced people all over the place, and they left their mark all over the place. Whereas the Hebrews were this sedentary people. They didn't build huge cities and stuff. They didn't build these monuments and write on them and all those things. They just didn't do that, But Tyre and Sidon and these type of places, like here, Tyre, Sidon, on the east part of this map, they became these famous trade routes, trade hubs. Okay. They would put their writing on monuments, on temple walls, on sarcophagus, on obelisks, and those things are designed to last, right? So their alphabet became the lingua franca of trade all across the Mediterranean. That's why the Greeks adopted it, okay? So as I was showing you, Frank Moore Cross, he argued that the Phoenician script was a standardized descendant of earlier Canaanite writing, okay? And Nemirovskaya, another scholar, she emphasized that Phoenician script dominance came from economic distribution, not from originating the idea. So they didn't invent the alphabet. They were just the best marketers of it. Okay. So this is why the archaeology favors the Phoenician model, because their inscriptions were made of stone and they lasted longer, and they were placed along all these coastal shipping lanes. So that's what archaeologists tend to find. That's what survives, But the Hebrew culture was nomadic, they're rural, and they wrote on perishable materials like leather, papyrus, and wood. So it doesn't last as long. So the core takeaway here is just that Phoenician wasn't the first script, it was just the first mass published script. And so just like today, distribution wins over invention. So, but the other problem is if the archaeology is biased, what actually survives, right? If the Phoenicians didn't actually invent the alphabet but just exported it, what can we find out about the origin of the alphabet, right? Okay, let me see. But there's a hidden bias in alphabet history. That's what I wanted to show you too. Sorry guys, I'm trying to find my notes here. I wanted to talk about this, how the Freemasons have a reverence for Phoenicians, okay? They have a deep reverence for Phoenician writing because they have this whole legend about Hiram of Tyre. Oh, maybe I should talk. Oh, wow, I have all these notes here. Wow, I'm so. Let me go back a bit here, guys. Let me go back before I talk about the Freemasons and stuff. Let's talk about these guys. All right. So Petrovich, he was saying that he found El, Moses, and El, and also Ahimsamak, and other Hebrew words there, right? But other scholars are saying, no, it's probably a little bit going too far with it. But Simons, he recognized that the acrophonic values, or the values of what sound attached to what image, it matched Hebrew lexemes better than Phoenician lexemes. Lexemes being words. Okay? And then Albright, he found that letter names reflect the Hebrew vocabulary and not the Canaanite or Phoenician terms. That's Albright here. And then Holmstedt, he said he didn't want, he was like kind of against just assigning it to the Hebrews, but he affirmed that it was Semitic, right? And so he even admitted that the Hebrew connection is very plausible. Okay. So you might say, okay, well, who's actually backing this up? There are many, as these people attest to, right? But there's many more coming, you know. So, like I say, Douglas Petrovich, this guy is from 2016. He said the world's oldest alphabet. He claims that several Proto-Sinaitic descriptions include Hebrew names. So you don't have to agree with Petrovich on this, you know. His specific readings are debated, but he's opened this idea of serious inquiry into the possibility of early Hebrew literacy, right? And he dared to ask the question others refused to. Could the Hebrews have written before 1000 BC? And he was the one that was able to broach the idea. And then Simons, who was a little bit before him, he shows that Proto-Sinaitic signs make more from phonetic sense in Hebrew than in other Semitic dialects. Okay? So he assigns letter values like to the ox equals aleph with known Hebrew words, aleph and aleph. Okay? So Simons doesn't argue from theology. He's arguing from the sound patterns. He's not like a Christian trying to bias toward the Bible, right? He's just pointing out that the sound patterns point to Hebrew rather than other languages. This guy Albright, he was one of the foundational figures in Semitic epigraphy, they call it epigraphy. This is from 1948, Albright. But he acknowledged early on that letter names, especially in Proto-Canaanite, fit Hebrew vocabulary best. All right? So he laid the groundwork back in the 50s, right? But the debate cooled down because secular scholarship didn't want to acknowledge the Hebrew possibility. Okay? And then even Holmstedt, who is more of a secular scholar, he critiqued Petrovich's idea and said that it's overreach, right? But he still affirms that the early inscriptions are Semitic and alphabetic and possibly Hebrew related. He's admitting this, right? So even if we don't prove it's Hebrew, we absolutely haven't proven that it's not. It's certainly not. It's more likely to be Hebrew than anything else, you know? So it's not just a fringe theory. I'm not just presenting some fringe theory to you. There's scholarly support for this idea. You have bold claims like Petrovich. You have cautious critics like Holmstedt, right? And you have neutral linguists like Simons and Albright. But they're all confirming at least one thing. The alphabet did not start with the Phoenicians. It started with Semitic scribes, and Hebrew is probably the best fit. Okay? So with archaeology, linguistics, and scholarship all pointing away from Phoenicia, the only thing left to do is ask, why does secular scholarship cling to so hard to the Phoenician story? Right? And that brings us to this last line of defense I was talking about, which is the Freemasonry idea. Okay? So, let me show you this other thing that I saw. Hang on. Look at this. Who invented the alphabet? This woman, right? Lydia Wilson at the Atlantic. And she's following the scholar Orly Goldwasser from Hebrew University, okay? They argue that the alphabet was invented by illiterate Canaanite miners as Serabit el-Kadim, which was one of the places I showed you. Because they're miners who wrote this stuff on the wall. And then we found the writing, and so they're saying, oh, the miners invented it. So the theory is that the miners couldn't read hieroglyphs, but they were inspired by them. So they created these simple phonetic symbols using acrophony. Okay? But it's emphasizes this revolution from the ground up, from the worker class, not from the higher ups, right? And so it bypasses the religious elite, right? But the thing is, even another scholar I found named Rolston, he was saying that it's unlikely that illiterate miners could have invented the alphabet, right? Like that's very unlikely, right? So just when the evidence for Semitic or even Hebrew literacy becomes too strong to ignore, that's when these scholars start saying, oh, it's because of these illiterate miners, you know? They try to flip the script and say the alphabet wasn't invented by the literate, but by the illiterate. But does that make any sense, you know? So this feature that they ran here, it says that she calls the alphabet the product of illiterate Canaanite miners who couldn't read Egyptian, but mimicked the symbols and invented phonetic letters by accident. But what's the appeal of this idea? This romantic, because it's like, oh, the workers overthrew the priest class, you know, and it's populist. It's like no elites. The elites didn't invent it. It's not a divine mandate from God. Nothing like that. It's just like these workers that were just creative and they pulled it off, you know. And it's modern. It's like language doesn't need God. It just needs necessity. It just needs people who are just need to write things, right? But the reason why it fails is this. This is what she wrote. One of civilization's most profound and most revolutionary intellectual creations came not from an educated elite, but from illiterate laborers. Right? But why this fails? It's like, first of all, you have this linguistic complexity problem, okay? Early inscriptions show that they had this phonetic logic. They had this idea already in their head that this symbol will represent this phonetic sound, right? And it reflects a lot. It reflects this very intelligent planning, not some accidental mimicry of the Egyptians. It doesn't make sense, right? And also we have this. There was religious vocabulary even in these earliest inscriptions. So it's probably not just that they're inventing something, but they're invoking God. They're trying to pray or write prayers, basically, right? So no known writing system. The other thing is that no known writing system in history was invented by complete illiterates. That doesn't make sense. The idea that an illiterate could invent writing doesn't make any sense, right? But this theory aligns with their secular ideology, okay? Because it allows them to say, oh, it wasn't from God. It was from people who just needed to write something. So But there's no linguistic evidence for this. It's just like something that they came up with, you know? And as I was telling you, even Rolston, who's a critic of the Hebrew idea, did I not have the Rolston quote here? Oh, Rolston. It would be improbable that illiterate miners were responsible for the invention of the alphabet. Now, this guy is not, he's not the type to represent the Hebrew idea. He doesn't support, he's not religious, he's not a Christian. But he'll say, no, it's unlikely that illiterate miners could invent this idea, you know? So whether these inscriptions were Hebrew or not, they preserve meaning. All right? So it shows that it's not just some random thing that people just decided to just try to write something. They're actually writing something meaningful about God, about religion, okay? So that's why it's no surprise that the first person to say in the beginning was the word, that's what I have there. In the beginning was the word, is writing from that tradition. John is writing from that tradition. In the beginning was the word. He's using it from that tradition of a religious idea that can be put into writing, right? The first writings were from religious ideas, not just random ideas about trying to figure out how to write stuff. Okay? So I did want to talk about a bit about the Freemason thing. Freemasonry has this reverence for Tyre and the Phoenicians. Okay, for example, one of their major things in their initiation ceremony is the story of Hiram of Tyre. Hiram of Tyre was one of the builders of Solomon's temple, and they always talk about Hiram as this keeper of the knowledge of building the temple, right? So that's why a lot of the early 18th and 19th century Enlightenment scholars they enshrined Phoenician as the origin of the alphabet, because they enshrined that Phoenician idea. They had this idea of the Phoenicians as the origin of wisdom and knowledge to build a temple and stuff, okay? But it's tied to that anti-biblical, secular, humanist worldview. That's why they tie that Egyptian idea. What evidence for the minor theory? Yeah, it's just those cave drawings, right? But that's the idea. That's the thing. Like, they're trying to say that they invented it by drawing it on a cave. But why should we think that? More likely that they already knew how to have some writing and they just wrote it there, right? That's the more likely scenario. But yeah. The alphabet took over, but truth be told, everyone around the world left some kind of writing, like in human need and intelligence. Yeah, that's true. That's true. But it's very interesting to move to the writing of the alphabet is very important, right? It changes everything. It changes our whole way of understanding things, because it allows us to just create you can develop any word, you can write any word using the alphabet, right? But if you have pictographic forms, you can't do that. But anyways, so whether these inscriptions were Hebrew or not, they weren't random, okay? They weren't meaningless. They were preserved in the intended meaning. They weren't just people trying to figure out how to write. They were writing actual words, they were writing actual meaning in there, okay? So the goal was always God, okay? The word. So John 1:1 isn't talking about Greek philosophy. He's writing that Semitic word theology, the idea that the word comes from God, the alphabet, the word, the writing of it. And so That's what he's talking about when he says, you know, that the word in the beginning was the word. And that's why he's not trying to copy Greek philosophy. He's actually trying uh to show that the Greek philosophy idea is wrong, you know? That's what we're going to talk about that in another episode of this. I'm going to talk about how the word is the Greek idea of the logos is not John copying Greek philosophy. So the Hebrew alphabet wasn't just functional; it was sacred. It carried these words, the covenants, you know, Exodus 24:7, the Torah. It carried the names of God, right? And you have these things. You have the name of God written in Paleo Hebrew. You can see that we found that. Okay. So this system is pointing to something greater, something holy, something truly beyond this world. You know, the Hebrews believed speech was sacred. God spoke and creation obeyed. Right. So their alphabet wasn't just phonetic; it was theological. From Aleph to Alpha, the alphabet carried this message. And then when John says the word, the beginning was the word, and then later he says, and the word became flesh, the word was made flesh, right? He's talking about Aleph to Alpha to Jesus, right? So I hope after everything we've examined here that you can see that the alphabets, maybe the bones of the alphabet were Egyptian, maybe not. But the heart of it is Semitic. The heart of it, the alphabet is Semitic. Okay? And it's probably coming from the Hebrews. And its destiny was to make way for the word that was made flesh. Okay? So it wasn't invented for accounting or for trade or for seafaring, but it was forged to write the Bible, to write the words of God, to receive the revelation of God. It was the vessel through which God spoke to his people, through which he gave them the names, the law, the covenants, okay? Now let me show you something from wait. Let me show you something from the Bible here. Oh, my Bible thing isn't even open. Wow. Hang on. Hang on, guys. Sorry, guys. Give me one sec. Where do I do this? Can I share the screen now? Okay. Let's go through some scriptures here. So, you have John 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made God, and the Word was God, right? So that's John speaking this kind of logic of the Word being holy, being from God, being a thing that can create, that can give meaning to anyone about what God is trying to say to us, right? And that's why he attaches the word idea to Jesus so strongly. And he's actually fighting back against the Greek idea of the logos. He's not trying to copy their logos. He's trying to, I think he's actually like reacting to it and trying to correct them, you know? Because the word was made flesh. The logos was made flesh. In the Greek mind, the logos could never be flesh. It could never be material. It was always something above the spirit world, right? But in the Hebrew mind, the word was flesh. Is the spirit world and the flesh worlds are connected. They're in the human body, in the human form, it becomes one. The flesh and the spirit are one. All right. That's why the word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. The glory as of the only begotten of the Father. And then this is Exodus 24:7. Remember, Moses wrote this, right? He took the book of the covenant and read it in the audience of the people, and they said, all that the Lord has said we will do, and be obedient. So he read the book of the covenant in the audience of the people. This is many, many centuries before the Phoenicians the earliest Phoenician inscriptions. This is like 500 years before that. All right. He's reading from the book of the covenant. So that means they had writing even then. And then look at this. You know this prayer, right? This is the most famous prayer that the Jews, even to this day, they pray it every single day, okay? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. And these words, which I command thee this day, shall be in thine hearts. And thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. And thou shalt bind them for a sign upon thine hand, and they shall be as frontlets between thine eyes. And thou shalt write them upon the posts of thy house and on thy gates. Again, 500 years before the Phoenicians, Moses is writing this to the people of Israel. Okay? It cannot be that the Phoenicians invented this. Deuteronomy 31:9. And Moses wrote this law and delivered it unto the priests, the sons of Levi, which bear the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and unto all the elders of Israel. So they had writing. They had writing much earlier than the Phoenicians, okay? If we believe the Bible as we do, right? So that's why when we go back to John 1:1, where did I have that? In the beginning was the Word, right? He's not borrowing from Greek philosophy. He's fulfilling this Hebrew revelation. The God is, he's found in the Word. Jesus is the Word, right? He's not quoting Plato. He's echoing Genesis. He's echoing this thing from Genesis that God spoke and then creation happened, right? God said, let there be light, and there was light. When he speaks, then there's a creation, right? The word is something powerful. Words have this power to create in the hand of God, right? So it's a totally different way of thinking about it than Plato. And that's why when you'll often hear these secular scholars saying that John is copying from Greek philosophy when he calls Jesus the word, the logos, right? Because the Greeks had that concept of the logos. But they thought of it as a spirit that existed above the material world that the material world can never strive to reach that level of perfection of the logos, right? Whereas John's not saying that. John's trying to say that no, the word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. The glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth, right? So the alphabet wasn't just a tool, it was a testimony. It was designed to carry the word, and that word became flesh. All right? So the greatest lie that these secular historians ever told is that language evolved by accident, that the alphabet came just accidentally or from these Phoenician child sacrificers. No, it did not. The truth is language began with God speaking. He spoke to Moses and Moses wrote it down. All right? That's what happened. And language will end when the whole world confesses that Jesus is Lord. All right? So I actually, you know what? I did have some more slides here. Anyway, I had a slide about how we're going to talk about. Anyway, forget the slides. Look, the point is, guys, let me just get rid of this thing. The point is, right, that The alphabet may have some influence from Egypt or some influence from Ugarit or whatever, but the most likely scenario is that it comes from Semitics and from the Hebrews. That's the most likely scenario. And the earliest examples of writing are far before the Phoenicians, so they did not invent the alphabet. They did not. And the most likely scenario is that the Hebrews invented it. And why did they invent it? Not because they're smarter, but because God gave it to them so that they could write the Bible. Okay? So anyway, next week I'm going to talk about how John's use of the word that became flesh, how that's not a Greek invention, how that's from his thinking on a Hebrew way of understanding things. Okay. All right. Kind of reminds me of how the Rastafarians will literally rearrange words to make them sound not bad, make them not sound bad. Like instead of hello, they'll say something else like hello has hell in the word. Really? So weird. Did Lehmann leave? Yeah, I think he did. Any thoughts on the Mayans and Incas per Liliana? Oh, the Mayans and the Incas? Well, that's also like pictographic, right? It's not alphabetic. That's the thing. That's what I'm trying to make you understand there. The alphabet is special. Okay? It's not like no one else developed an alphabet. And there's some talk about how the Koreans supposedly had an alphabet. Maybe it was much later on. But the alphabet that we have, it's the same one. It comes from we're told it comes from the Phoenicians. Then they gave it to the Greeks, and the Greeks picked up on it, developed it, and then the Romans popularized it, and that's where we get an alphabet, right? That's the idea. But what I'm suggesting to you is that no, it comes from the Hebrews, and then the Phoenicians picked it up from them, and then they spread it around. That's the rest of the story is fine, okay. But the origin is from the Hebrews. That's my idea, you know? And while the evidence isn't conclusive at this point, the best theory is that the Hebrews are the origin, okay? Good sound logic, backfire the inspired. Hey, man, that's right, Frank. Amen. Hey, Layman. You're welcome, brother. All right, so that's my presentation on the alphabet, the origin of the alphabet. We're going to do some more on this about John and the Word, all right? I'm going to do some more about that. But for now, that's I'm going to leave it there.
Okay. I'm studying the Bible in Toronto. 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 Studying the Bible with Mike, Sam, Pat. These other YouTubers are just so trash. Hit the thumbs up if you want to support. Go follow Mike as he follows the Lord. I'm studying the Bible in Toronto. 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 You better watch out, Mike's calling out the shields. If you're not free grace, you need to sit down and chill. We're not hyper grace, you know we keep it real. Eternally secure, you know that we're sealed. We don't back low, we're not workspace heretics. Mike's not in it for the money, trying to get a lick. They out here selling their souls for a couple clicks. Becoming Freemasons so they can't just get rich. I'm studying the Bible in Toronto. 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 Shout out to Mike, Sam, Pat. Check out his channel, Toronto Bible Study. Subscribe and like.